inequalities. Drawing on his own experiences and cutting-edge research, Simon will share how leadership can drive positive, system-wide change and create a more purposeful organisation. We're also pleased to have our colleague, Professor Gerard Hodgkinson, Professor of Strategic Management and Behavioural Science at AMBS, who will facilitate the session. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Simon Hayward.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Is my mic working? It is, great. Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for coming. It's wonderful to be here at the University of Manchester. And it's particularly relevant because it is ranked #1 in Europe amongst business schools for its social and environmental impact, and second in the world for that. So that's particularly rewarding, I think, for us here at the university, and relevant to what I want to cover today. So thanks, Stuart, for your kind introduction. So first of all, I'd like to ask you one or two questions. Or not? Seems to stop working. There we go, we're working. Okay, what are these numbers? What might these numbers represent? Anybody? Anybody who was in the room when we were doing setup? Well, you're not allowed to answer. Well, let me tell you, the world's richest 1%, and many of us know this fact, have more wealth than the bottom 95% of the world's population. Of the top richest individuals in the world, all are men, by the way, nine are from the US, live in the US, and 8 are tech billionaires. And yet, the extreme poverty in the world is increasing for the first time in 25 years. Okay, another quick one. What might this be representing? It's the 200 largest economic entities in the world. The numbers, what do they represent? Roughly 80% of those largest economic entities are not countries, they're companies. So 80% of the richest entities in the world, let that sort of sink in. These corporations generally, the business community, really has control of much of the world resources, much of the supply of drugs and food, much control over the debt burden, sovereign debt burden of low and middle income countries. And yet many companies are not acting with a sense of responsibility that brings. What I'm arguing today is about a research agenda that delves into why is that? Why are organizations not taking responsibility, their role in society, more seriously? And particularly importantly, why at an individual and a team level are leaders not leading the way? Nietzsche believed that freedom is accompanied by responsibility for one's choices and actions. Now, leaders of large organizations in particular have huge freedom, especially in this interconnected international world, to devote resources where they see fit. My argument is they're not allocating those resources effectively to address some of the imbalances that have been with us, perhaps particularly over the last 50 years. In the 80s, the economic man became the prevalent economic model. We became more and more me-oriented, more and more consumer-oriented, gradually less community-oriented. And the responsibility and the reciprocity that perhaps was endemic in society before that has gradually disappeared. So how can corporate leaders help redress that balance and reset the way we operate? And one more number for you. This is a statistic from the WWF's 2024 report talking about the catastrophic loss as wildlife numbers have gone down by 73% in the last 50 years. 73% in the last 50 years. So we are collectively destroying our planet. We all know that. But who has the resource and the responsibility to ensure that what we extract from nature, we give back to nature? Much of the damage is through commercial activity, such as the growing of food for human consumption and animal consumption. And it's compounded by the fact that the global south has only 31% of global wealth, but it has 79% of the global population. And finally, in terms of sustainability, we all know about the Sustainable Development Goals that were signed off by all UN members in 2015 in terms of the goals for 2030. These 17 SDGs, these goals, many organizations are signing up to some of them and doing some activity towards them, but we're on track to miss all of them. Now, the goals are ambitious, and I meet business leaders on a regular basis who have signed up their organizations to support action towards some or all of these development goals. The issue is that they are in the minority. Adam Smith wrote that justice is the main pillar that upholds the whole edifice of our society. He talked about the invisible guiding hand of morality and responsibility. And he said, without justice, society will crumble into atoms. Justice is in short supply, in my view, in the world, as we've just seen. So this throws responsibility and questions back to the leaders of corporations that control much of our world resource. And the evidence of a lack of justice is thrown by scandal after scandal after scandal. And these are just a few examples, but many of them are well known to us. So, why are companies feeling it's okay to operate in what is in effect a moral vacuum without a sense of any moral responsibility? Even brands, household brands and well-known organizations that we assumed perhaps could be trusted turn out not to be the case. Yeah. So, in summary, we live in a challenging context. Organizations are operating in a challenging context. What I want to focus our research conversation about is what are individuals and groups of individuals doing, and why are they doing it in a way that is not addressing this crisis that affects us all. The climate emergency, I haven't mentioned the technology explosion and how that's changing society, geopolitical instability, and capitalism being in crisis. So, a key question for leaders is, where is their focus? What are they focused on? Is it shareholders and short-term shareholder profitability, or all stakeholders we've just been looking at? And we've been living with Milton Friedman's doctrine around the fiduciary responsibility of directors being to focus on shareholder profitability and value for over 50 years. And it's no surprise that the acceleration of some of the issues I touched on earlier has been associated with that increasing focus, but just on shareholder value. And this is being challenged by many organizations in sufficient numbers, but the B Corp movement, for example, is a good example where organizations are signing up and doing something different. And there's now 2,000 B Corp companies in the UK alone, over 9,000 around the world, which is fantastic. But it's a drop in the ocean, really, when we think about the wider population of companies. So Freeman, a bit confusing because we've got Friedman, and then we've got Freeman. So Edward Freeman wrote in the 80s about the importance of stakeholder capitalism, of stakeholder responsibility in organizations. And he said that the achievement of corporate purpose, a stakeholder is any group or individual who can affect or is affected by the achievement of a corporation's purpose or objectives. That includes employees, shareholders, the planet from which we're extracting resources, customers, supply chain, nature, government, and so on. All these stakeholders are critical and need to have need to be at the forefront, in my view, of how individual leaders of large and small companies, but particularly large organizations, are allocating resources, defining strategy, and having an effect in the world. So, corporate leaders have a choice which side of the seesaw their organization sits on. And at the moment, it's rather imbalanced toward shareholder value. This is a strategic issue. It's a leadership issue. And I don't see enough research going on around the world and in organizations like this business school to address the micro foundational aspects of why leaders are not taking these responsibilities as seriously as they might. But obviously, leadership, in my view, has to be part of the solution. We need to also recognize that leadership happens at all levels of the organization. And I'm particularly focused on those at the most senior level because of their strategic control of resource allocation and strategy. But leadership happens across the organization. And it is people in all levels of an organization have a responsibility and an opportunity to do something. But the control is really at the more senior levels, hence the focus. Okay, so today's agenda. We've talked a little bit about the need. I won't come back to that. I'm going to talk to a little bit of an overview of what leadership research has been doing over the last 100 years. That should take a couple of minutes. And then we'll look briefly at responsible leadership in particular, and then sort of suggestions around a forward research agenda. Thank you for the introduction, Stuart. The only thing I'd add is that the opportunity to work in this university at this time is very exciting for me personally. Joined the university as a staff member about 18 months ago, and as I get more involved, I get more excited about the opportunity to work in an interdisciplinary way on some of these issues that we're facing, given the university's deep-seated commitment, as I said, to social equality and the environment. Okay, so let's look at the evolution of leadership research. What's happened over the years, we're going back to Mary Follett's power with instead of power over theory in the 20s, scientific management and Taylorism, theory and X and Y, situational leadership. These are all theories that have evolved over time. And what's happened since then is that one theory has tended to evolve into another, or particular aspects of research have focused into one particular item. So, for example, authentic leadership and ethical leadership was a particular deep dive into an area of concern when ethics and authenticity became more prevalent. But what we've seen over time is an increasingly shared approach to leadership, a more distributed approach to leadership, and a sense that everybody has a role to lead in an organization. And very much more recently, there's greater emphasis on the adaptive nature of the organization and its ability to adjust as a whole mechanism to radical changes in the environment, adaptive or agile leadership, and then bring it right up to date around responsibility and this emphasis on purpose. By purpose, we're talking about higher societal purpose rather than simply making money for shareholders. So it's been a bit of a cook's tour, but there are strands in this that are very much continue to be focused on relationship, behavior, and attitude, and that's been the sort of predominant aspect of this development of leadership over time. This summarizes some of the challenges that I see with the clients I've worked with for the last 30 years. Some of the things that are most in their mind in terms of trying to orchestrate a transition and adapt their organization to be able to cope more effectively with the dynamic situations in which they find themselves. So the things that they want to move away from are things like being siloed, hierarchical, inconsistent customer experience, slow, traditional, and slow decision making, and change doesn't stick. And the things on the right are much more consistent with what organizations are trying to achieve as they become more adaptive around teamwork, fluidity, leadership at all levels, consistently positive customer experience, and much more disruptive thinking than perhaps they expected in the past. Interestingly, this is the key piece of research from my more recent book, Agile Leadership. Right at the heart of it is purpose and direction. But I think the heart of leading an organization nowadays, or leading a team nowadays, is about having a strong sense of why this is important, as well as what we're trying to achieve. I'll come back to that more later, a bit later. But things to highlight on here are important as leaders create an environment where their people can become more agile and adaptive. Are things like psychological safety become very mainstream now. So being safe, encouraging learning and innovation, and the experimentation that drives innovation. Disruptive thinking is an interesting one. With large corporates particularly, that seems to be the sticking point. It seems to be one of the areas where they find it most difficult to change how they have been, to invite and encourage disruptive thinking. There was research back in the 90s, actually, by Cranfield that looked at people who were being made redundant in one of the first major redundancy programs. And there was a disproportionate emphasis on non-conformity. As the non-conformists, the people who would be disruptive and change and challenge the system, were let go, because there is the organizational norm, and the protection of the organizational norm is a higher priority than perhaps the innovation that technically people are seeking. So that's a key issue. And then ruthless prioritization is also a major challenge. Large organizations particularly find it difficult to prioritize and decide not to do things, so they keep a lot of things spinning. But teamwork, collaboration, agile decision making, and the customer vision are all part of that mix. What's interesting also is that there's a paradox between the enabling function of leadership to create a coherent, connected, positive, psychologically safe environment for people to do great work, and the willingness and ability to create an environment which welcomes disruption and welcomes innovation and invites challenges to the very system that we're trying to create. And that paradox is something that is coming through more and more in leadership research, and in practice. It's increasingly important, I think, the organizations we work with. F. Scott Fitzgerald famously wrote that the sign of true intelligence is the ability to hold two conflicting thoughts in one's mind at the same time. So being both an enabler and a disruptor is a nice way of paraphrasing that. So going on to sort of responsible leadership. So in 2018, the British Academy had sponsored and had work done on a report into the future of the corporation, and the key conclusions that Colin and the team there came to. The first was that we concluded that the purpose of business is to solve the problems of people and the planet profitably, not to profit from causing problems. Which sounds pretty simple, but it's actually getting to reversing the current status that many organizations are causing problems to the planet, the environment, and to societies in which they're extracting value, and turning that on its head. So I think this is really powerful. And a personal example was our purpose at Cirrus, which is my last business, which I'm with Claire and others. Our purpose was better leaders, better business, better lives. And that, for me, was just encapsulated everything that was important to me and so important to my colleagues about what we were doing, because as we helped to build better leaders, being nicer to each other and more collaborative and more effective together, they were having a performance impact on the business, but also creating an environment where people could be more productive and happier and more effective in their life. Gartenberg from Wharton has been leading some interesting research into the power of purpose. So the Wharton research is demonstrating quite strongly quite a strong relationship between a purpose-driven organization where there's an emphasis on meaning of work and contribution to society and profit. So these do not need to be at odds. Profit can be the organizations where have a strong emphasis on purpose tend on average to lead to stronger profitable outcomes over time. It's not the short-term cycle of quarterly reports to Wall Street or financial market, but over time, that purpose effect it's engaging to people. It's productive. It creates a productive environment, and it's particularly true. Gartenberg's research suggests amongst organizations where there is an ownership structure in place that has a longer-term perspective. So that could be private companies, I've been working with Chiesi today, which is an Italian pharmaceutical organization, very purpose-driven, a B Corp, and they have a very long-term, they've had a lot of long-term success. So, but they're privately owned, they're family owned. So a lot of family owned businesses have longer term view and a greater discretion about is this organization purpose driven or surely driven, only driven by short term profitability for shareholders, or those with long term investors and long term shareholders. But that's not the norm now because of the way the markets operate. So back to the seesaw. Is it shareholders, short term value and profit, or long term prosperity for all shareholders, the stakeholders? Sorry, and this is at the heart of the discussion I want to have today. So defining responsible leadership. There are, since Mary Follett in the 20s, certain academics and certain researchers have highlighted the importance of responsibility as part of what a leader should be embracing. So she talks about the profession of business management involves assuming grave responsibilities. Prahalad, I always pronounce that wrong, Sika Prahalad, talks about managers must achieve success with responsibility. And Henry Mintzberg talks about responsible management. I don't see how you can manage and ignore the social consequences. So there have been commentators highlighting this, and there's a greater body of research emerging over the last 5-10 years into this area, all indicating that leadership needs to take this responsibility seriously. And there is some progress, and there are various initiatives that are going on, including, for example, the initiative around international integrated reporting, which is looking at creating a new framework for corporate reporting and the emphasis that needs to be placed. And this is an extract from it, but it talks about that in terms of strategic focus, that there needs to be recognition and reporting on how the organization is able to create value. And a lot of it is about value creation in the short, medium, and long term, and to use its use and its use and effect on the capitals. Now, the use of the word capitals is really interesting because it's not just about financial capital and return on financial capital, but it's financial, it's human capital, it's social capital. About communities, it's about manufactured capital, intellectual capital, and natural capital. There's recognition that there is capital, there are various sources of capital, and many organizations can extract disproportionate value from those capitals without returning anything. So there's this movement to become more regenerative, and the phrase regenerative leadership is becoming more common, where we leave things better off than when we started. We're giving more back to society and to the environment than we extract, which is the opposite of current practice typically. Now, the IRR and others are trying to nudge corporations to report differently. And there's a lovely piece of research that let me just find it in my notes. The B Lab report this year. So B Lab is the organization that supports B Corps. And they did a piece of research that 76% of the UK public believe that the law should be changed to require directors to take their responsibilities for people and the planet equally alongside their responsibilities to generate profit. 76% of the UK population believe that should be the case. Because people want to see business acting as a force for good. So let's think about defining the responsible leader. What do the words mean? So responsible, having a duty. There used to be a sense of duty in a position of responsibility, and we need to get that back. This moral obligation to behave correctly. Leadership is a process of social influence. It's about achieving things through and with others, through the influence we can exert over them to encourage them to take part and commit their effort and resource to that end. We can't make people be committed. We can force them to do something, but that's not terribly productive. But we can encourage them, and we can invite them, and we can lead them where they choose to commit their full effort, and that's what leadership is all about. This is a great piece of definition from an article by Waldman and Siegel back in 2008, where this debate about shareholder value or stakeholder value was played out through letters between the authors, and they talk about a responsible leader feels the inner obligation to do the right thing. So there's ethics in there, There's a moral standard and a concern for others, an obligation to act and accountable for the consequences. So it's about real strategy and resource allocation, and it's about balancing the concerns of multiple stakeholder groups. Yeah, so he's got to move away from this obsession with shareholders. Now, there are different levels of responsibility that we can see playing out, and this is from combining 2 or 3 different sources. But the base level is do no harm. So if we even got to a stage where corporations did no harm across the board, that would be brilliant, wouldn't it? It wouldn't have the Niger Delta and sweatshops, and wouldn't have slave labor and so on. So do no harm is good, but it's minimum. It's about risk mitigation, and it's quite often about legal obligation. Common practice in the middle is better. It's a more positive, significant effort to do good. So it's positively motivated rather than risk mitigation. So this is good. So there's often in organizations you see programs to do development projects and allocation of resources to do good things in society. But the core of the business is not necessarily being affected by that. What we're really after is regenerative practice, the next level, where organizations are committing the organization to be responsible in the environment. The organization be responsible for the societies in which they extract value, and so on, and to be paying back more than they are taking. I believe that a lot of managers are caught in the middle. As I say, there are a lot of very responsibly oriented managers in a lot of organizations around the world who want to do the right thing, and they're doing enough, and they're doing some good stuff. But they haven't got the organizational permission to really take it to the next level, where the whole organization is committed and resources are allocated and strategy is redefined in line with responsibility. And situational strength is a factor in this, because individual leaders making these decisions are affected by the dynamics and the cognitive and emotive affective processes going on around them as they're making these decisions. There's a lot of tension about how far can we go before we invoke the ire of the market. The shareholder in this is also very important. So Colin Mayer, who was a key author in the British Academy report, he offers this as a definition of the responsible shareholder. So shareholders do not and should not have rights to do with their companies what they please. Charles Handy says, companies are not products. They're not things we can dispose of and do what we like with. They're communities. And they have roles and responsibilities as well as rights and rewards derived from their dependence on and obligation to the societies in which they operate. So the current research landscape around responsible leadership, there's 3 main areas. And actually at the moment, I think they're oddly distinct. So there'll be a group of people working on purpose-led leadership, there's a group of people working on responsible leadership, and there's a group of working on responsible management. And they're not talking as much as perhaps they might. So purpose-driven leadership is more about the guiding principles and the mindset and the focus on societal impact. Responsible leadership tends to be more behavioral oriented, and responsible management tends to be more critical of management per se. Our opportunity first opportunity is to review that and help bring together these 3 different areas into a more integrated and coherent approach, which would help with the communication with the business community. Because at the moment, the academic work is a little bit disparate, and bringing that into a more coherent whole would help us have greater influence, in my view. So that would link together with the things like the antecedents and the attributes of leaders, but also the processes that are going on in organizations around decision making and implementation. So we suggest there are 4 domains of responsible leadership where greater research on a joined up nature would be beneficial. There's the ethics and values, so the ethical decision making aspects of it. There's the responsibility to stakeholders and the allocation of resources associated with that. There's the sustainability of the planet and the sustainability goals and the environmental aspects. And then there's this prosperity and the long-term viability of the organization and its stakeholders, and the sort of financial aspects of it, all of which need greater research. And we need to be looking at the inter and intra personal processes that are going on when decisions are being made about how corporate resources are allocated. So it's also helpful to think about internal and external here. There's an element of this which is about within the organization creating an environment where responsibility flourishes, and there's an external perspective which is about the stakeholders and the negotiation and working with stakeholders more widely. And oddly enough, I would say so, wouldn't I? But agile leadership on the one hand is quite a helpful frame of reference for the internal, and the responsible leadership framework on the right is obviously focused more on that. I think it's quite helpful to ask the question, what are we teaching our students? Are we teaching them about profit maximization and shareholder value? Or are we talking about responsible business and stakeholder value? Is it primarily focused on Milton Friedman or Edward Freeman? Is it amoral or is it moral? Is it based on profit for shareholders or value, long-term value for all stakeholders? And I don't think it can be both, because they're mutually inconsistent. And we have a choice as a school, I would suggest, humbly. To quote the AACSB, which is one of the accrediting bodies for the business school, be bold. Let's be bold, they say. Let's educate the leaders of tomorrow to understand and take their responsibilities seriously for stakeholders and not just shareholder value. Let's be bold, because we have that position of influence as a business school. So just a few words on the future research agenda. I'd love to see it move from being don't take this the wrong way, everybody, but a little bit ad hoc, more coherent and collaborative across disciplines. It's often driven by personal interest, which is great. But what we lose there is the opportunity to have more mission-driven and focus on being a place that drives force for good. There's an emphasis on publication. It's fine, but are we really maximizing our collective contribution to the world? Who reads what we publish? And therefore, I suggest moving from rather limited impact on the business community to a global impact and greater influence. Business as a force for good. And in each of these areas, there's opportunities to delve more deeply into the micro-foundational and personal aspects of this, the team and collective aspects of this, and the way that those play out in strategy and in resource allocation and innovation, and so on. Conscious of time. The current research agenda, which I'm working on with Gerard and one or two others, is developing a descriptive model around this and to develop greater behavioral insights of how to shift executive mindsets and behavior so that people that have the power and the influence to make these changes happen, what is going on with them, so we can hold up the mirror to those people in a way that they find acceptable. So to summarize, the call is for a more integrated approach across different aspects of different parts of the university, different parts of the business school, but also outside the business school, to take societal purpose and stakeholder responsibility to a new level. It's an opportunity for us to put, in my view, leadership as a central ingredient of that mix, because I and others believe that leadership and leaders are the key to orchestrating accelerated emphasis and accelerated impact in the way businesses make choices and businesses operate. So I'll stop there, and Gerard will lead a Q&A. I hope that was of some interest.
Why don't we take a seat? So we'll just have a chat for a couple of minutes, and then we'll gradually draw the audience in as is customary at these sorts of events. So that is a great tour de force. It really sets out the scale of the challenge. I'm kind of interested that on two levels. On a personal level, you're obviously much closer to seeing some of these principles in the early stages of adoption than many of us have been. So what can you tell us? What insights can you tell us about how you've seen some of these, we'll call them principles, have been carried out thus far in practice? And then a kind of related question is, I'm kind of curious, as I'm sure many people are, why you've been pulled into the kind of the Micro Foundations approach is very much at the moment, but why? Counterintuitive for many of our colleagues who come from broader social science disciplines like sociology, political economy, political science, international relations. They'll be very curious why this focus on the individual level, the micro level and the meso level, rather than the structural level.
Well, answering the first part at first, but I think the two are linked, as you say. I've been working with leaders of organizations, many of them are large global corporates, for the last 30 plus years. That's been my job. I've been working with them at senior levels and much more broadly across the whole enterprise to help them get their head around changes in behavior and changes in practice that will make the organizations more connected, more agile, more customer centric, more innovative. And a lot of those practices are driven by the mindset of those leaders. Do they believe in some way that this is important? And if they do believe it, or if we can help them think it through so they start to believe it, then they're more likely to change their behavior. If they change their behavior, they'll change policy. If they change policy, the organization or the bit that they represent the organization can change. Without behavior changing, without mindset changing, none of that plays out or is sustained. There might be short-term changes because one feels an ought to or thought it was a good idea, but if the belief set hasn't changed, then the behavior won't and the practice won't. So, the most rewarding work I ever do or have done is when I'm working with not just senior people actually, but where I'm working with leaders who go through some sort of road to Damascus realization from within their own belief system that actually there's something much bigger than simply driving short-term performance for short-term profitability. There's something bigger that they're part of that they could be contributing to that means something at a much higher societal level. That is true. It's consistent with the 76% of people in the UK who believe that the law should be changed. That once we've got that connection, people will start to behave differently, and their organisations will start to behave differently. So that's what animates me. Therefore, focusing on mindset and the micro foundational aspects of the individual and the interactions between individuals, why they are thinking and behaving the way they do, the effects of emotion and behavior on their thought processes. All of that feels to me like exactly the right way into this conundrum of trying to move the dial on responsible leadership, on responsible business practice. Because if the leaders don't change, the organizations aren't going to change. And leaders aren't going to change in a sustainable way by being told to. And they may do it to a point, they'll avoid harm. But they're not going to go to the next level changes if they don't believe it. We have to go back to them as individuals and understand why they are reacting. What are the trade-offs they're making that mean that they stay at the middle level of implementation, or just at the do no harm?
Okay. Why don't we invite some questions then from the audience? Let's do things a bit differently. Let's start with online. Let's ask for a question online. Have we got some questions coming in?
So there's that many online that actually I've not been able to keep up with them as you've been talking. So I'm just going to go to the one I'm looking at as we speak. John Clements asks, what do you think are the key factors that would engage UK SMEs in the concepts of responsible business among all pressures they're already under?
Now that question gets right to the heart of the macro backlash, which would say it's all well and good changing the mindset of a responsible leader and even the senior leadership team. But what about the fact that despite that, the fundamentals are the regulator is operating in a particular way that very often reinforces this obsession with the pursuit of shareholder wealth. Some would say greed, and other stakeholders who are structurally, shall we say, quite powerful and have the ability to move resources if they don't like the way things are going. They can put their investment in. So how do we face that really?
I think the first thing is, the question was on SMEs. SMEs, the majority of B Corp are SMEs. And I mentioned earlier the Wharton research into the relationship between purpose and profitability, and that's a very strong. There's a very strong indication that where there is a stronger link between purpose, a purpose-driven organisation, i.e., having a higher societal purpose, and long-term profitability amongst those organisations that owner manage or owner. There is a private ownership structure with a longer-term view because they can. Because so Roche or Pentland Brands or Patagonia or White Company, they're privately owned. They can take a view that says, I don't mind if the profits dip in the next year or two because I'm doing what I believe is right, and it will come good. And it does quite often. And we know there's a dip in the market value of sustainability stocks at the moment. But those organisations are operating on the basis that it will come good. And the markets believe that it will come good. Just right now, it's pretty difficult. I think in the short term, the short-term economic pressures, remember the fourth quadrant is financial viability of the firm is essential. We have to make sure that the organisations are self-sustaining, as well as looking after their stakeholders. Because they've got a lot of employees and they've got a lot of shareholders. So those stakeholders require those organisations to be financially viable. So we're not saying be purpose-driven, even if it costs you the business. Then be purpose-driven by helping the business take a long-term view, and that will lead to long-term value and success. That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Let's take the question. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You just wait for the mic, and then if you start by saying who you are, that'll be helpful.
It's online; they won't hear you.
Be the student here. Oh, sorry. All those four quadrants we tied up. And unless there's a culture collapse, the four quadrants stand alone. And in that culture,
What? Sorry.
intersectional. Because if the board is not intersectional, the shareholders are not intersectional, it's going to be very, very hard to be agile, using a word, or to actually look at a broader picture for the long term.
Yeah, I agree with you. So if I can come in on that, I think the cultural aspects of this are critical, and that's again the leaders have a disproportionate impact on the culture and the climate of the teams in which they operate or the organisations they lead. So I totally agree with you. The culture is key, and the board has some influence on the culture of an organisation because of its influence on policy, perhaps. But the most direct influence on culture is the leaders of the organisation within the organisation. The senior leadership team, the executive board, or whatever, and senior managers. And so they are the people that I think it's helpful to target most to help them get their head around changes in culture, and then there's a chance that culture will shift. And then when the culture shifts, it can become more responsible. So I agree with that. Yeah.
I'll just give two examples. Global Investment Partners. The head of which was
You have to speak into the mic.
Oh, sorry. I have Global Investment Partners. The head of Global Investment Partners is Bayo Gulasi, who actually spoke at the school. He was able to refurbish Gatwick Airport, Edinburgh Airport, and City Airport. And his company has just been bought by BlackRock, and he's the second largest shareholder. Now, and he was also lead director on the board of Goldman Sachs. So when you have people who have other perspectives, then they can actually see where the market is going and think of it. If I'm a distance runner, one of the things that I've always found is that if you speak to government officials, the senior management, and they can actually see the values that you're trying to talk about. When they can see that, the relationship, and as I'm sure you know this, becomes much more personal, and then it's much more easier to shift the focus. I think we've become too myopic, and I've learned with this. In 2030, McKinsey says 4 of the largest cities will be in Africa. 4 of the largest cities will be. And it would also have the largest population. Yet we're still looking at the Western-centric model. when we should really be more global integration.
I agree.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. No, I agree. I mean, the imbalance, you've highlighted one aspect of the imbalance that's going on in society, and the educated and uneducated imbalance, the rich and poor imbalance, the north-south imbalance. These are massive structural issues in our society that are leading to greater societal breakdown, which worries me and others, I'm sure. So that's a really good point. Yeah.
Is it on? Yeah. So it's Nuruddin Amershi from a company called Winners Corporation Limited. Simon, from the concept of the fish always rots from the head, rather than look at the corporation side, which I totally agree with you, going into a larger scale of countries. So we look at Mr. Trump, we look at Mr. Xi, we look at Mr. Putin. Where are these guys getting their leadership qualities from? And is it right? Or are we being guided, because they control far greater resources than those 200 companies, but in the end, with the spending. So where is this leadership coming from? I mean, a lot of people are getting misguided. Is this true leadership, or are we being led astray, or is it self-interest? Or so just your comments on those leaders.
Well, I think I mean, since the 80s, there's been a shift. We've tended to assume responsibility for all these societal issues are with government and not with companies. Whereas 100 years ago, that probably wouldn't have been with something. So we've moved away from a sense that all corporations have a responsibility in the society from which and in which they extract value. So I would put it back and say, countries have some responsibilities to create an environment and to create a climate and create a tax regime and so on that is conducive to organizations being more responsible. I agree. But ultimately, it's 100, what was it, 174 or 178? What was it? So the number of the 200 biggest economic entities are companies. Yes, so they have much greater control of the resources, the debt in the world, the food supply, the use of consumption of in the environment for food production, for example. That's down to companies. So I think we've got to keep putting it back. Yes, the governments have responsibility as well, but companies have the primary responsibility, and they have that discretion and the ability to act that perhaps politicians don't have. So I just keep pushing it back to. Well, comments on reckless world leaders, I think I'll probably leave to a drink over later.
Okay. Why don't we take another online question?
Thank you. Someone asked if you had a magic wand that would enhance one capability of all business leaders tomorrow, which one would it be?
I'd ask them to reconnect with their values and what's important to them as human beings. And when they're outside work, what's important to them? It might be their family or their friends or their society, or they come into work and they're driven by something different very often. There's almost like leave your values at the door in a paper bag. And ethics then become quite difficult in organizations other than compliance. And I'd ask leaders to get back in touch with their personal values and the values of society. And that then leads to their recognition that they have responsibilities to a broader set of stakeholders than simply the shareholders that sign off their pay packet. And interesting, there was some research that came out last week. It might have been LBS or somewhere like that, but it was research into CEO motivation, and it was saying actually CEOs are not just motivated by short-term money and bonuses and LTIPs. They're actually motivated by fairness and recognition, more so. But they want to be treated fairly compared with other CEOs, and they want to have recognition, and high salaries are a form of recognition. But they're not just motivated by money per se. Obviously, that's part of it. So we shouldn't just assume that CEOs of large corporates don't have values and are not motivated by similar things to us. They are. They're human beings. Let's help them tap back into their own humanity.
Okay, two hands went up together. Yeah, okay. All right, yeah. Go.
This one? Yes, hi. Thank you very much. I graduated almost 30 years ago
I live in Cyprus.
We really
Yes.
need you to speak into the microphone and
Yes.
speak loudly.
Okay, sorry. In the early 2000s, we had a speaker come out in the business school to Cyprus and Greece to talk about the role and the duty or the responsibility of the business schools in a financial crisis. So some constructive criticism here. What they were presenting then was that actually ethics was an elective module; it wasn't a core module, and that, of course, sort of hit home most of us because I was then in the banking sector, and I just wanted to know: is that still an elective or is it a core module?
I don't know. Somebody who's involved in the MBA curriculum might be able to answer that. Is ethics a core or elective one? We don't know. We'll find out for you.
Okay.
Not-
Because this is constructive criticism, of course. It's because I think that talking from the point of view of a business school, I guess some of those leaders must have sort of gone through business schools.
Absolutely, no, but I think your point, if your point is about should ethics be central to the curriculum, I totally agree. That's what I'm trying to say. We need to be educating the leaders of tomorrow to say that these are important factors in the leadership of organizations, and profit and shareholder returns are just one part of the picture, and they need to see the whole picture. That's their role, and we need to help them get their head around that. And we need to be able to hold up the mirror to individuals by doing much better research into why they are doing what they're doing, what's driving their behavior. What's causing them to have a mindset that says it's okay to extract value from forests or sell diesel cars in America with criminal software, or why is that okay? We need to ask, and not all corporate leaders are doing that, but they're not necessarily embracing fully their responsibilities, and we need to hold up the mirror. And that is partly through macro factors like economics and so on, but it is particularly around aspects around behavioral research and micro foundational research is saying, why are you making the decisions and making the choices you're making? And that's what we need to do more on that. Which goes back to your point back.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks. So Dee Gallagher from AMP Corporate Communications. I just wanted to ask Simon, when you're advising these large organizations, how do you deal with the cultural challenges that come into play in a global organization? And I guess where I'm coming from, and the culture point, for me, it's a sort of brand issue, but from a leadership perspective, I worked for a global corporate that's listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and I think the UK exec, there were some very purpose-driven leaders who were essentially overruled by the US exec. I think culturally, it's incredibly different. And in that instance, the CEO voted with his feet and walked from the UK. But I think all that means is that there's, these things are continuing and they just put someone else in to fill the gap. And some of the things I thought being on the comm side, the corporate comm side, is quite frankly terrifying. I think there's, what's going on out there is there's immoral, there's unlawful, there's all sorts of stuff happening and they aren't accountable. So, how do you deal with that because I think obviously it's very difficult to reach the whole when it's an organisation of that size.
Well, culture change is a very complex area, and it's not. But I mean, that's what we've been doing for a long time in our business world. I think you need top down, bottom up, sideways in, different ways in which to engage people across all levels of the organisation in changing the narrative, through social constructed remaking of the sense of this organisation. Why are we here? What's the narrative? What are we doing? But I would say without the active sponsorship of senior leadership, it's always more difficult. And you might be able to change the culture in one entity, like we said, the UK business of an American corporate. I've had this experience as well. But it is subject to the permission from the ultimate CEO and the executive. So I agree, but it is possible to help change parts of an organisation. But it's always more challenging, and there's always that sense of it'll last as long as the people in charge here create that umbrella of protection that we can operate like this. And that goes right down to the micro team level as well. So yeah, bottom up, socially constructed change, absolutely very powerful, but top down permission is also critical.
Let's ask a related question. And what about this idea that there are inter-organizational macro cultures, that cultures reside among collectives, sometimes within sectors, sometimes even across sectors along the supply chain?
Yeah.
How might we influence those?
Well, let's take an interesting example is I've worked quite a lot in the apparel industry, sporting apparel industry, and there's a federation, a global federation of sporting goods, apparel manufacturers, with people like Nike and Adidas and people like that on. So driven by some of its members, Patagonia, Pentland, and companies like that, they have got together and said, not only do we want to change the way we operate as a company, but we want to change the way the industry operates. So they have for many years been working together to create a consensus across the industry to say there are certain things we will not tolerate. In the supply chain, we must not have children working in sweatshops. We must not have slave labor. We've got to have fair wages and so on. So they have orchestrated as an industry system, if you will, or an industry community, quite radical change in the way they operate. Now, it's not perfect, and there's a lot of things that are not, the organizations that perhaps don't fit into that, but they have organized through individual companies taking the lead and then bringing others together to change the conversation and therefore change the response of those organizations to be more responsible. And it's quite impressive. And it's all started by conversations that senior people have had and said, is this good enough? We could do more. So changing the conversation, even at an inter-organizational level, has a huge influence.
Yeah, sure. Okay. How are we doing online? Are there any comments coming in?
Got a lot of comments, a lot of questions. A couple of people have touched on, Simon, you mentioned government earlier, but they'd be interested to hear your views on leadership in the public sector. So someone in particular has mentioned the NHS, and they've said it's desperate for proper leadership, and how would you advise on that?
I think that's probably a slightly different issue. I'm not an expert on the NHS. I've only worked very briefly in NHS clients, so I can't really comment on specifics. My observation is a lot of people working in the NHS have a very strong sense of purpose and a very strong commitment to the cause with which they're engaged and to their patient safety and patient well-being, and find the way they're managed and led sometimes very frustrating, which would suggest that there is a leadership issue. But I don't think it's necessarily about responsibility. I think I think there's different aspects. There's something else going on there that is not working well. I don't think people who administer hospitals are amoral or don't care. I think they care as well. It's just the way they are approaching it is somehow actually quite dysfunctional at the moment on occasion, or certainly not optimizing the way care and provision of health services can be organized and managed and led. So I think it's actually a very different topic to what I'm focused on. But I'd be really interested to explore how they overlap with those who do a lot of work in health leadership.
We're just about bang on time, so we're going to have to draw a close here. I'm sure the conversations are going to continue as we have some refreshments together. So I'm going to hand back to Stuart, who's going to close things down. Thank you very much, Simon.
Okay, so yes, thank you very, very much to Simon and Gerard for this afternoon's fascinating talk. Thank you also to members of the audience, both here and online, for the thoughtful and insightful questions that you raised following Simon's presentation. For those of you that are here present in Manchester, please join us outside in a moment for some drinks to celebrate the lecture. And then we hope that you'll be able to join us again for our next event, which is on Wednesday, the 8th of November. And Sir Terry Leahy we'll be joined by Professor Philip McCann from the school, and they're going to discuss one of the most pressing challenges of our time, and that's the growing economic disparities within and across our cities and regions. So I do hope that it'll be possible to see you all again in November for that talk and presentation. But now, thank you very, very much. And once again, thank you to Simon for such a fascinating talk.